Students, so today's topic is measurement of macroeconomic activity. So basically, what we are going to understand today is a country's economic activity we are going to measure. And in order to understand this, you need to understand the circular flow of income which you learned yesterday. So I'm not repeating that concept, but I just want to touch upon that concept so that it's easier for you to understand how an economy's activity, macroeconomic activities are measured. So, as you can see, so in a closed economy where there is no international trade happening, you have two major sectors in an economy. So you have households here and you have firms here. And so households possess these four factors of production: land, labor, capital, and enterprise. And firms use these factors of production to produce goods and services. So let's say household sector is giving all these four factors of production to the firms, and then firms using these factors of production produce goods and services worth rupees 100, for example. And for the for the factors of production that they have given to the firms, households in turn receive rent, wage, interest, and profit. So these are the factor payments for each of these four factors of production. For land, it is for land. Sorry, for land it is rent. For labor it is wage. For capital it is interest, and for enterprise it is profit. So for example, these are the different amounts that each factors of production is receiving as a factor payment. So totally, when you add all these things, it is rupees 100. So the total income received by the households is rupees 100, and the value of goods and services produced by the firms is rupees 100. So now that now that the households have this income of rupees 100, they are spending this 100 rupees on the goods and services produced by the firms. So the expenditure on goods and services by the households is rupees 100. So what you can understand is these values are all the same. So the total income from lending the four factors of production to firms is 100 rupees for the households, and the value of goods and services produced by the firms is 100 rupees, and households spending on goods and services produced by firms is 100 rupees. So um, so it is the same 100 rupees which is being circulated in an economy, in a closed economy where there is no international trade, where the country is not trading with any other country. So this is the simplest version. Using circular flow of income, macroeconomic activity of any country can be measured. And there are three methods to measure macroeconomic activity. The first one is expenditure approach. So here what we do is we add all spending in the country to buy final goods and services. So this is written in yellow color, and this is basically about this expenditure on goods and services that we discussed in the circular flow of income. So if you have understood this, so it is easy to understand this expenditure approach. So here what we are doing is basically we are adding up all the final spending to buy goods and services produced in an economy. And the second approach used to measure macroeconomic activity is the income approach. So here what we are basically doing is we are adding up all income earned by the four factors of production in an economy that produce all goods and services within a country over a time period. So this is written in purple color, and if you have understood this income, this part of the circular flow of income, rent, wage, interest, and profit, then it's easy to understand the income approach. And the next one is the output approach. So here basically what we are doing is we calculate the value of all final goods and services produced in a country over a time period. So we only consider the final goods and services produced in a country, not any intermediate goods, not any goods that go into the production of some other good. So I'll explain why we only consider the final goods and services. So what you have to understand is, we calculate the value of all final goods and services produced in a country over a time period. So these are the three approaches, and again, this is written in um, red color. And if you have understood this part of the circular flow of income, so it's easy for you to understand this output approach. So I have used these three different colors used in this circular flow of income for these three approaches, so that you can uh, link these three different approaches to this circular flow of income. So this is basically the income method, and this is basically the red color one is basically the output approach, and the yellow color is basically the expenditure approach. So these are the three different approaches or three different methods that we use to measure macroeconomic activity. So in any country, it is important for us to measure the macroeconomic activity, because we need to understand how the economy is doing and where it is progressing. For example, right now, if India's economy is kind of facing a severe recession due to coronavirus and all that, um, just by looking at just by using one of these methods, you will be able to understand how the economy is doing. And you can also use either three of these approaches or one of these approaches to compare countries macroeconomic position. Uh, uh, you can compare countries macroeconomic position with some other countries macroeconomic position. For example, you can compare India's GDP with some other countries GDP, and you can understand how India is doing when compared to some other country. For example, you can compare India's GDP with China's GDP, and you can understand how India is doing when compared to China. Okay, so now let's look at each of these methods or approaches in detail. So the expenditure approach measures the total amount of spending to buy final goods and services during a particular period. Usually, that's a financial year. So usually within a year. So the total spending in an economy is split into these four components. The first one is consumption spending by households. So, if you take spending by all the households in the economy, you get consumption spending. For example, if I'm buying a shirt, and if you're buying an iPhone, and if your parents are buying a car, so these are all consumption spending by households. So you and I belong to this category, households. The next one is investment spending by firms. Firms also spend on capital goods as part of their investment. For example, if you're running a factory and if you want to open up another factory, so you spend money on your investments. So you buy raw materials, you buy so many other things to construct this new factory. So your spending will be investment spending, or if any multinational company is opening its branch in India, so then that spending will be investment spending. And these spending are by the firms, not by the households. The difference is firms spend on investments and households spend on final goods and services. So that is basically the consumption, and this is basically the investment. So in short, this consumption spending is denoted by C, and investment spending is denoted by I. And the third component is government spending. Government also spends money on good on many things. So it provides merit goods, and it constructs airports, and then it spends money on public goods and so many other things. For example, if it is presently, if it is opening up many hospitals. I mean, right now the corona virus is going on, and then if the government is opening many hospitals, then that is government spending, and it is denoted by G. And the last component here is net exports. So here basically what we are looking at is we take exports, which is denoted by X, and imports. So X is basically the value of all exports, which is nothing but foreigners spending on our country's exports. For example, if you are exporting diamond from Surat, so foreigners are spending money on your exports. So that is foreigners spending on the country's goods and services. And M is the value of all imports. So basically, this is the country's citizens spending on foreign goods and services. If you're buying an iPhone, so it's basically coming from China or from yeah, it's basically coming from China, and then you're spending my money on Chinese good. So you're spending money on foreign goods and services. So now, if you take the difference, then that is net exports. So if you add all these things, C, which is consumption spending, and I, which is investment spending, G, which is government spending, and net exports. If you add all these things, what you get is the country's GDP. Adding all this spending, you get this country's GDP. So you have C, I, G, X minus M, which is net exports. So we take the difference of export minus imports. So you get country's GDP. So by looking at country's GDP, you can understand how the economy is doing, whether it is doing well, whether it is GDP is growing or declining, and all these things. So right now, during this lockdown, so which of these components will be higher? So of course, consumption spending will be the lowest, and then the investment spending will be the lowest, and the government spending will be the highest. So during normal time, usually the consumption spending is the highest, but then presently in India or in most of the countries, the G, which is government spending, is the highest. So here you have the real life example. So this is taken from RBI website. So this is how country's gross domestic product or GDP is calculated. So you have private final consumption expenditure, which is C basically, and you have government final consumption expenditure, which is G, and gross fixed capital formation, changes in stocks valuables. So these things come under investment spending. And you also have exports of goods and services, which is X, and import of goods and services, which is M. So if you take the difference, that becomes net exports. And you have this for different years, and these values are measured in current prices. Current prices means the value of GDP in 2012-13 is measured in this year's price, and 2013-14 is measured in this year's price, likewise for the other years. Okay, so now how do you define GDP? So GDP is nothing but gross domestic product, which most of you are aware. So it's basically the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country over a time period, usually a year, usually a financial year. Okay, so now there are two, three things that you need to keep in mind. The first one is, as far as investment is concerned, we not just include investment made by the firms, but we also include investment by the government, which is basically the public investment. For example, presently, if the government is investing so much money on the health sector, so that is also included as part of investment. And the other thing is, the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that when we calculate GDP, we only include investment in physical capital, not on human capital. For example, if the government is opening a hospital, or if a firm is opening a factory, So these are all physical capital. So these things will be included, and so any investment on human capital will not be included. For example, if the government is giving scholarship to students who are doing well, which is basically the investment on human capital, so that will not be included in investment. Okay, so that's about the first method, that is expenditure approach. So the next one is the income approach. Okay, so here what we do here, we add up all factor payments such as rent, interest rate, wages, and profit, and what you get finally is the country's national income. In most of the cases, it is not same as country's GDP, because we add something to GDP and we deduct something from GDP to measure national income. So that will be explained. That will be explained a little later. So again, this is written in purple color, and this is same as this part in the circular flow of income. So rent, wage, interest, profit. So these are the factor payments for the factors of production that you are giving to firms to produce goods and services. So this part is basically the income approach. Okay. The next one is the output approach, and this is again related to this part in the circular flow of income. So if you have understood this, so you can easily relate. Um, so please bear with me because I have to go back and forth just to link what I'm explaining to the circular flow of income. Um, okay, so here you have output approach, and it measures value of all. It measures value of each good and service produced in the economy. And as I explained you before, to avoid double counting, intermediate goods are excluded, and only final goods and services are considered. Because if you start including intermediate goods, there will be double counting. For example, if you have already calculated the value of wheat, which is being used in the this wheat is converted into flour, and then that flour is converted into and that the flour is used in a bakery to make bread. So the value of the bread includes the value of all these things, wheat, flour, and all these things. So instead of calculating the value of wheat, value of flour, you can just take the value of final value of bread. So that includes the value of all these things. So to avoid double counting, we exclude any intermediate goods, and we only consider the final goods and services. um, so it calculates value of output by each sector in an economy. So in an economy you have different sectors. You have agriculture sector, you have IT sector, and you have banking sector, you have so many other sectors. So basically what we are doing is we take the value of output from each of these sectors and we add all this, and then we get the country's GDP according to output approach. For example, um, India's uh, India's GDP in agriculture, or basically India's output from agriculture sector, output from IT sector, and output from aviation sector. So if you take all these things and likewise the value of output from the other sectors, then what you get is the country's GDP according to output approach. Okay, so now you have to understand the difference between GDP and GNI or GNP. Okay, so you might be wondering what these terms of GNI and GNP. I'll explain. So GDP, as you all know, is gross domestic product, and then what you have to understand, what you have to pay attention here is this part of this this term. So here In GDP, you have to pay attention to domestic, gross domestic product. It is so this indicates that um, here we basically look at the output produced within a country. So that's the reason we have this thing in the term domestic. For example, Hyundai. Hyundai is a Korean company, and it has its factories near Chennai and in other places. So and it manufactures cars, and then it is also exporting to other countries apart from selling the cars in India. So all the output produced by Hyundai in India is part of India's GDP because it is located within the boundary of India. So this domestic in this domestic in GDP means output produced within a country. Okay, so that part is understood, I guess. And the next one is gross national income, or GNI, or gross national product. Earlier it was known as gross national product. Now it is known as gross national income, or in short, GNI. So it's basically the income of countries' residents, regardless of where they reside in the world. So here, what you have to pay attention is this part of the term national. National means it does not matter where the country's residents are living in the world. They can be living in USA, they can be living in Middle Eastern countries, they can be living in Singapore, uh, but then all the income earned by these residents living in different parts of the world, we add to countries' GDP. Likewise, many foreign nationals are living in India, and they are sending their income or part of their income to their own countries. For example, in our school, we have some Philippines teachers in music department and all that. So they might be earning their salary here, but then either their entire salary or part of their salary is sent to their home country. So such income is deducted from country's GDP. So what you basically do, you take the income of residents, India's residents living in different parts of the world, and you add this income to country's GDP, and you deduct income earned by foreign nationals living in India. You deduct this income from GDP. So yeah, so in Hyundai's case, the profit made by Hyundai in India is repatriated to South Korea, and that will be deducted from India's GDP. And income sent by Indians living in Dubai or Middle Eastern countries or any other country will be added to India's GDP. So GNI basically is equal to GDP plus net factor income. Net factor income means we add such income, like Indians living in other parts of the world. So we add that income, and then we deduct income earned by foreign nationals living in India. So that's basically net factor income. So GDP plus net factor income is basically gross national income, GNI or GNP. Okay. Um, so what you also have to understand is the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. Just to understand the difference, just consider the following example. So it's just an example. So this is India's GDP in 2018 and India's GDP in 2019. So the country is producing, for example, 10 products, and the price of each product is 10 rupees 10. So the value of country's GDP is rupees 100. And the next year, 2019, the country is producing the same amount of goods, which is 10. And the prices have increased from rupees 10 to rupees 15. So the value of country's GDP is now rupees 150. So if you just look at the value One might think that the country's GDP has grown, and then might also think that the country is now producing more goods and services. If you just look at these two values, that's how anybody will think. But then this may not be true in all the cases. So sometimes the increase in the country's GDP is due to increase in the price, or it is due to inflation in the economy. So by looking at India's 2019 GDP, one can come to a conclusion that India's GDP has grown, but it need not be true. Nominally, the value would have increased, but the increase in GDP value is not because we produce more goods and services, but because of inflation. That's basically the rise in price level. So, this increase in the value of GDP is due to inflation, which is nothing but increase in the price level in the economy. Okay, so now to understand um, how actually the India's GDP has increased, what you have to do is you have to eliminate this price effect, which is the increase due to inflation. So this can be done simply by calculating this 2019's GDP by using 2018 price. So 10 multiplied by 10 instead of 15, you get 100. And now you understand that the country is producing same amount of goods and services, and there is no increase in goods and services. So what we have done here is, so we have eliminated the price effect, or we have eliminated the effect of inflation here. Okay, so that's how you understand the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. So if you take this 150, the nominal value of this 150, that is nominal GDP, to calculate real GDP, you use base year. So usually to adjust or to eliminate the price effect, we use the price of one particular year, which is called as base year. Um, Here 2018 we consider it as a base year, and then we use this year's price to calculate real GDP of India in 2019. So instead of 15, if we use rupees 10, then we are calculating real GDP. Okay. Nominal GDP or GNI is measured in terms of current prices at the time of measurement. So prices during that particular year, and it does not account for changes in prices. And real GDP or GNI measures economic activity that have eliminated the influence of changes in prices. And real GDP is a measure of output valued at constant prices, constant or unchanging prices. So in the example above, if you calculate India's 2019 GDP by using 2018 prices, you will get real GDP adjusted, and that real GDP is adjusted for inflation, eliminating price effects. So this I just explained now. So in this case, 2018 becomes what we call in statistics a base year. So usually to calculate real GDP and to eliminate the price effect, we use base year, and that base year is free from any macroeconomic disturbance. For example, 2020 cannot be used as a base year because right now the economy is not normal. So you have this coronavirus lockdown and all that, and then the prices are abnormal. I mean, so this 2020 cannot be used as base year. Maybe you have to use some other year as a base year and use the prices in that year to calculate a real GDP in the subsequent years. um, so in reality, so that's very simple to understand, but then in reality, to eliminate any such price effect, the economists use price deflator. You must be aware of these terms, and you must carefully understand these concepts. So we use price deflator or GDP deflator to deflate the price effect. So this is the formula for um, GDP deflator. So GDP deflator is basically the nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. And obviously, um, you can also calculate real GDP using the same formula. So real GDP is basically the nominal GDP divided by GDP deflated multiplied by 100. So now I'm using this textbook example to explain how we calculate GDP deflator. So how to calculate GDP deflator and how real GDP is calculated using GDP deflator. So this is a calculation of nominal GDP. So this example is given in the textbook. So you have, for example, the country is producing these three goods and services: burgers, haircuts, and tractors. And in 2001, these are the quantities produced in each of these three cases: burgers 37, and haircuts 15, tractors 10. And 2001, in the same year, so the price, these are the prices of each of these commodities produced in the economy. Now, if you multiply both quantity and price, you get the value of these goods in 2001. And now, if you add the values of each of these goods, what you get is this 881 is the value of GDP of this country in 2001. And in 2002, these are the quantities produced in each of these cases. Now, um three more burgers are produced from 37 to 40, and two more haircuts and one more tractors. And the prices also have increased. So instead of 3 pounds, now you have 4, and instead of 18, you have 20, and instead of 50, you have 60. So the prices also have increased, the quantities also have increased in 2002. So now if you multiply both, you get the value of these goods in 2002. So if you multiply both, you get 160. If you multiply both, you get 340. If you multiply both, you get 660. And now when you add all these values, you get this, which is value of GDP in 2002. The same thing we do for 2003. So this is the value of GDP in 2003. Now, uh, this is basically the nominal GDP, and here we haven't used any base year to eliminate the price effect. And because just by looking at these values, one cannot come to the conclusion that the country is actually producing more. Of course, there could be some increase in the quantity, but then part of this increase in the value of GDP is due to the inflation or the increase in the prices. So 881 to 1160, and from 1160 to 1223. So just by looking at these nominal values, you cannot come to the conclusion that everything is due to increase in number of goods and services produced. Part of this increase is due to increase in the prices or increase in the inflation. Now we have to calculate the real GDP, or we have to eliminate the effect of inflation or any increase in the price. So what we do here, we assume that 2001 is the base year. Okay, so the base year price remains the same, and in the subsequent years, what we do, um, these quantities are multiplied by the base year price. So in the nominal GDP, what we did, so the 40 is multiplied by this year's price, but here what we do, this 40 is multiplied by the base year price. So 40 multiplied by 3, and 17 multiplied by 18, and 11 multiplied by 50. So now if you multiply both, you get the value of GDP in 2002, and the same thing we do for 2003. So now you can see, so this is real GDP, And then now you can see you can see that we have eliminated the price effect. So in nominal GDP, the value of GDP in 2002 was 1160, and after we have used base year price, it is 976, and here it is 941 instead of 1223. So to calculate real GDP, 2001 is considered as a base year, and the prices of this year are used to calculate real GDP in the subsequent years 2002 and 3. I hope you have understood this. So if you have any doubt, you can post your queries in the classroom. Now we can use the GDP deflator formula to get values of deflator for each year. So we are using this formula. GDP deflator is equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. So the respective years values are given below. And again, this is taken from the textbook. So GDP deflator in 2001 is basically the nominal GDP value, which is 881, and the real GDP value. The base year value is always 100, because the nominal GDP and real GDP value will be the same in the base year. So what you get is always 100 in base year. So this is basically an index method, which is a statistical tool used to calculate real GDP and to calculate inflation and all that. So so using the same formula, so we get GDP deflator in 2002. So the nominal GDP is 1160 divided by the real GDP after adjusting for inflation, or after eliminating the price effect. So the real GDP is 976 multiplied by 100. So what you get is 118.8. So likewise for 2003. So GDP deflator in 2003. So 1223 is nominal GDP divided by real GDP 941. So what you get is 130. And this value means, and what you have to understand is that in the base year the value is always 100, and by looking at how much it has increased from base year, you can understand how much the prices have increased. For example, this is 118.8 when compared to the base year value, which is 100. So by looking at this, we can understand that this value means the prices have increased by 18.8% when compared to the base year price. So the prices in 2002 have increased by 18 percentage, and the prices in 2003 have increased by 30 percentage. So just by looking at this GDP deflated value, one can understand how much the prices have increased in an economy. Now, putting all the values together, we have this. So you have different years, and you have nominal GDP for each of these years, and then real GDP, where you have eliminated the price effect, or you have adjusted the value for inflation. So you have real GDP values for each of these years, and you also have GDP deflator. Okay. So most of the times in the exam, it is possible that you are given um, any two values here. For example, you might be given nominal GDP value or GDP deflator value for each of these years, and you might be asked to calculate real GDP, or you are given the values of real GDP and the values of GDP deflator, and you are asked to calculate nominal GDP. So with any two values, you can calculate the other one. So now with values of any two variables, we can find out the value of the other one by using either of the formula below. So either using this formula or this. Basically both are just the same. And GDP and GDP per capita, so you need to understand the difference. So we have understood what is GDP. So that's basically value of all final goods and services produced within a year during a particular period of time, usually a financial year. So um, if you have GDP, it's easy for you to calculate GDP per capita. Per capita means per person or per head. So GDP per capita is this is the formula for GDP per capita. is equal to GDP divided by total population. If you take GDP value and divide it by the country's total population, what you get is GDP per capita. This is nothing but GDP per head. For example, India's GDP is some values, let's say 3 lakh crores or something, and then divided by the total population 130 crore, then what you get is GDP per capita. So GDP per capita tells how the country's national income is shared among its citizens. Consider this example. So you have this is just an example. So you have two countries, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. So these are the GDP values of these two countries, 500 billion and 500 billion. So the GDP value is same for both these countries, but then the population is different. So in Sri Lanka it is 30 crore and Bangladesh it is 60 crore. So which country will be better off? Now you can see. I mean, anybody can easily tell. So here this GDP is divided among smaller population, which is 30 crore, and here the same GDP value or the same GDP is divided among a bigger population, which is 60 crore. So obviously Sri Lanka, because GDP, which is equal for both the countries, is shared among smaller size of population in Sri Lanka compared to Bangladesh. So naturally, Bangladesh is in a Sri Lanka is in a better position because its GDP is shared among smaller population, and Bangladesh GDP is shared among the bigger population. So that's all for today. So what we all have discussed today is the we just revised circular flow of income, and I didn't want to repeat this, but then I thought it is necessary for you to understand three different approaches used in macroeconomic activity. So that's the reason I just touched upon the circular flow of income. So this is basically the income method, and this is basically the output method, and this is basically the expenditure method. And yeah, so the expenditure method, income method, and output method, and we discuss each of these thing in detail. So in expenditure method we take spending by different stakeholders in an economy. Spending by households is consumption, spending by firms is investment, spending by government is government spending, and you also have net export. So if you add all these things, what you get is GDP. So this is the real life example, India's GDP for these years. Um, Again, this is current prices. So these values are nominal GDP values. These are not calculated based on constant prices or the base year prices. These are calculated based on current prices of each of these years. And yeah, so we looked at the income approach, we looked at the output approach, and we looked at the difference between GDP and GNI or GNP. So if you and what we understood is GNI or gross national income is nothing but GDP plus net factor income. Net factor income, what we do, we add residents, countries residents living in different parts of the world, and their income we add, and then we deduct the income earned by foreign nationals living in the country. So what we get is net factor income, and you also have nominal GDP and real GDP. So we looked at all these things, and yeah, so these are the formulas for GDP deflator, real GDP, and all that. And this is how. So here we have nominal GDP, and then here we measure real GDP, where we eliminate the price effect and all that. Yeah, and so this is GDP deflator value, and I told you that in the exam, it's not that always this is how the questions are asked, but then you also have to understand that the questions can come in any form, but then in some cases you are given any two values and you are asked to find out the other value. So you can do that by using these formulas. And finally, what we discussed is GDP and GDP per capita. GDP per capita is GDP divided by total population. So this will help you understand how the country's wealth is shared among its citizens. So yeah, so that's all for today. So I'll post some additional resources, and I'll also post some assignments which you have to complete and then post it on the Google Classroom. Okay. So that's all for today, and take care. Stay safe. Take care. Bye bye.